A boy with a disability is abandoned, but what the dog does changes everything. The social worker's car pulled away from the dirt road, leaving nothing but a cloud of red dust and the sound of Tommy's ragged breathing. He sat exactly where they'd left him, on the ground beside his crutches, watching the vehicle disappear into the haze of the late afternoon sun. His legs, thin and twisted from cerebral palsy, were folded awkwardly beneath him. He'd fallen when they'd pushed him out, his crutches clattering uselessly beside him, and he hadn't bothered trying to stand back up. What was the point? The outback stretched endlessly in every direction. Spinifex grass and red earth broken only by the occasional ghost gum, standing sentinel against the vast sky. Tommy was 8 years old, and he understood with perfect clarity that he'd been left here to die. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, under the relentless Australian sun that would blister his skin and bake the moisture from his small body until there was nothing left but bones and regret. His foster father hadn't even looked at him when he told the social worker to stop the car. The woman, young and overwhelmed and clearly new to this godforsaken territory, had protested weakly. But when Tommy's foster father had handed her an envelope thick with cash, her protests had died in her throat. Tommy had watched the transaction with the detached interest of a child who'd learned early that adults would always choose their own comfort over his survival. Too hard, his foster father had said, the only explanation offered. Can't handle a cripple kid. Thought I could, but I can't. The social worker had helped Tommy out of the car with hands that trembled, and then she'd driven away without looking back. Tommy didn't blame her. He'd learned not to expect better from people. His real mum had given him up when the doctors had explained the extent of his disability. The first foster home had sent him back after 3 months. The second had lasted 6. This one had made it almost a year before deciding he was too much trouble. The sun was starting its descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Tommy had any energy left to appreciate beauty. His mouth was dry, his lips already cracking. They hadn't left him water, hadn't left him anything except his crutches and the clothes on his back. He supposed they figured it didn't matter. Dead was dead, whether it took hours or days. Tommy closed his eyes and tried to remember his mum's face, but the memory had faded to nothing more than a vague impression of dark hair and sad eyes. He'd been 3 when she'd left him at the hospital and never come back. 5 years of being passed from home to home, of seeing the disappointment in people's faces when they realized he'd never walk normally, never run, never be the easy, grateful child they'd imagined when they'd signed up to be foster parents. A sound broke through his thoughts, panting, heavy and rhythmic, growing closer. Tommy's eyes snapped open, his heart suddenly pounding with a fear more immediate than the slow death he'd been contemplating. Wild dogs were common out here, dingoes that ran in packs and weren't afraid to attack anything they perceived as weak or injured, and Tommy was definitely both. The dog that emerged from behind a cluster of saltbush wasn't a dingo. It was bigger, broader, with a coat the color of honey and sand. A mixed breed of some kind, maybe part cattle dog, part something else entirely. Its ribs showed through its fur, and one of its ears was torn, healed badly into a permanent fold. The dog stopped about 10 meters away, regarding Tommy with intelligent brown eyes that held none of the wildness Tommy had feared. "Go on," Tommy said, his voice cracking from thirst and disuse. "Nothing for you here, mate." But the dog didn't leave. Instead, it sat down, its tongue lolling as it panted in the heat. They stared at each other for a long moment, boy and dog, both abandoned by the humans who were supposed to care for them. Tommy could see scars on the dog's body, places where the fur grew back in strange patterns, suggesting old wounds, old pain. This was an animal that knew suffering, that had survived it. The dog stood and took a tentative step forward. Tommy tensed, but there was no aggression in the animal's posture, no threat in its approach. Another step, then another, until the dog was close enough that Tommy could see the flecks of gold in its brown eyes, could smell the earthy scent of its fur. The dog sniffed Tommy's outstretched hand, then his face, its nose cold and wet against his hot skin. "You're lost too, aren't you?" Tommy whispered. "Someone dumped you out here, same as me." The dog made a soft sound, not quite a whine, not quite a whimper. Then it did something Tommy hadn't expected. It lay down beside him, pressing its warm body against Tommy's side, and rested its head on the boy's lap. The weight was comforting, solid and real, in a way nothing had felt real since the car had driven away. Tommy's hand moved almost of its own accord, fingers tangling in the dog's fur. It was coarse and dusty, matted in places, but warm, so warm. The dog's breathing began to slow, its body relaxing against Tommy's, and the boy felt something crack open in his chest. Not hope, exactly. He wasn't naive enough for hope, but maybe something close to it. Maybe the knowledge that if he had to die out here, at least he wouldn't die alone. "I'm Tommy," he said softly. "Don't suppose you've got a name, do you?" The dog's tail thumped once against the dirt, sending up a small puff of red dust. Tommy took that as a no. "Reckon I'll call you Rusty," he said, looking at the dog's golden-red coat. "Is it all right with you?" Another tail thump. Tommy found himself smiling, just a little, despite everything. Despite the thirst that was making his head pound and his vision blur at the edges. Despite the pain in his legs from the awkward position he'd been sitting in for too long. Despite the absolute certainty that they were both going to die out here under the vast, indifferent sky. "Well, Rusty," Tommy said, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "Guess it's just you and me, then. Not much of a team, are we? A crippled kid and a beat-up dog. But I suppose we'll make do." Rusty lifted his head and licked Tommy's face, one long swipe of his rough tongue that made the boy laugh despite himself. The sound startled them both, a brief burst of joy in the gathering darkness. Then Rusty settled back down, his warmth seeping into Tommy's side, and the boy let his eyes drift closed again. He didn't know how long they sat there like that, the sun sinking lower and the temperature beginning to drop with the characteristic swiftness of the outback. But when he opened his eyes again, Rusty was standing, looking off into the distance with his ears pricked forward. The dog glanced back at Tommy, then at the horizon, then back at Tommy again. "What is it, boy?" Tommy asked, trying to follow the dog's gaze, but seeing nothing except the endless stretch of bush and the darkening sky. Rusty looked back at him one more time, then walked a few steps away. He stopped, turned back, and whined. The message was clear. "Follow me." But Tommy's crutches were lying in the dirt a meter away, and his legs, which barely worked on a good day, felt like dead weight after sitting in one position for so long. The idea of standing, of trying to move, seemed impossible. "Can't, mate," Tommy said, hating the defeat in his own voice. "Can't walk? Not really. Not without help." Rusty returned to him, circling once, then moving to position himself directly in front of Tommy. The dog crouched low, his body tense, and waited. Tommy stared at him, not understanding at first. Then Rusty turned his head and looked pointedly at his own back, then at Tommy, then at his back again. "You want me to hold on to you?" Tommy asked, incredulous. "Mate, I'm heavy, and my legs don't work right. I'll just drag you down." But Rusty didn't move. He stayed there, crouched and waiting, with a patience that seemed almost human in its determination. Tommy looked at his crutches, then at the dog, then at the rapidly darkening sky. If Rusty had seen something, water maybe, or shelter, staying here meant certain death. At least trying gave them a chance, however slim. Tommy reached out and grabbed 2 handfuls of Rusty's fur, gripping as tight as he could without hurting the animal. Rusty stood slowly, so slowly, taking Tommy's weight as the boy used the dog's body to lever himself upward. Tommy's legs shook violently, his muscles spasming with the effort, but Rusty held steady. When Tommy was finally upright, swaying dangerously, Rusty moved closer, pressing against his side to provide support. "My crutches," Tommy gasped, but Rusty was already moving impossibly towards them. The dog picked up one crutch in his mouth, the metal and plastic frame looking absurd clamped between his jaws, and brought it to Tommy. Then he went back for the second one. Tommy took the crutches with shaking hands, positioning them under his arms. With Rusty pressed against his right side, providing warmth and stability, Tommy took his first painful step, then another. Each movement sent jolts of pain through his twisted legs, but Rusty matched his pace perfectly, never pulling ahead, never lagging behind. The dog seemed to understand instinctively how Tommy moved, where he needed support, when to slow down. They moved through the bush as the last light faded from the sky. Tommy had no idea where they were going. No idea if Rusty actually knew of somewhere safe or if the dog was just moving on instinct. But moving felt better than sitting and waiting to die. Moving meant fighting, even if the fight was pointless. His foster father's words echoed in his head with each painful step. Too hard. Can't handle a cripple kid. Well, Tommy was handling himself just fine. With a bit of help from a stray dog, he was handling himself brilliantly. The stars emerged overhead, more stars than Tommy had ever seen in his life. The city lights of Darwin, where he'd spent most of his time in foster care, had washed them out. But here, in the deep outback, the sky was alive with them, a river of light flowing across the darkness. It would have been beautiful if Tommy wasn't so focused on putting one foot in front of the other. If his mouth wasn't so dry that swallowing had become painful, if his arms weren't screaming from supporting his weight on the crutches. Just when Tommy thought he couldn't take another step, when his vision was starting to tunnel and his legs were threatening to buckle completely, Rusty stopped. They were at the edge of a small gully, and Tommy could hear something that made his heart leap. Water. The sound of water trickling over rocks, faint but unmistakable. "You found water," Tommy whispered, his voice cracking with emotion and thirst. "You clever, clever dog." Getting down the slope into the gully was treacherous. Tommy half slid, half fell, his crutches useless on the uneven ground, but Rusty stayed with him the whole way, providing what support he could. They landed at the bottom in a tangle of boy and dog, and Tommy's laugh was slightly hysterical, edged with exhaustion and relief. The water was barely more than a trickle, seeping from a crack in the rock face and collecting in a small pool no bigger than a dinner plate. But to Tommy, it looked like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He crawled to it on his hands and knees, his legs dragging behind him, and plunged his face into the water, drinking in great, desperate gulps. The water was warm and tasted of minerals and earth, but it was wet, it was real, and it was saving his life. Rusty drank beside him, their heads nearly touching as they lapped up the precious liquid. When they'd both had their fill, Tommy collapsed onto his back on the sandy ground beside the water, staring up at the stars. His body ached in ways he didn't have words for, but he was alive. They were both alive. "You saved me," Tommy said, reaching out to rest his hand on Rusty's side. "Why'd you do that? You don't even know me." Rusty shifted closer and lay down beside Tommy, his body warm against the boy's side. The temperature was dropping fast, now that the sun was fully gone, and Tommy could feel himself starting to shiver. His t-shirt and shorts were no protection against the cold outback night. As if reading his thoughts, Rusty pressed even closer, sharing his body heat. Tommy wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in Rusty's fur. The dog smelled of dust and sweat and something wild, but Tommy didn't care. Rusty was warm and solid and real, and right now, that was everything. "My foster dad said I was too hard," Tommy whispered into Rusty's fur. "Said he couldn't handle me. Reckon lots of people have thought that. My mum thought it. All the foster families thought it. Everyone thinks I'm too broken to be worth the trouble." Rusty made a soft sound, something between a whine and a grumble, and Tommy felt the dog's tail thump gently against his leg. "But you don't think that, do you?" Tommy continued, his voice getting sleepy now, exhaustion pulling him down. "You're pretty broken too, aren't you, boy? But you're still here, still fighting. Maybe that's what broken things do. Maybe we just keep fighting, even when everyone else has given up on us." The last thing Tommy felt before sleep claimed him was Rusty's steady breathing, the rise and fall of the dog's chest against his own. In the morning, they'd need to figure out what to do next. How to find food, how to survive, how to get back to civilization, assuming they even wanted to. But for now, in this moment, curled together in a gully under a blanket of stars, Tommy felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt safe. Tommy woke to the sound of something scraping against rock. His body was stiff and cold, despite Rusty's warmth, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then the events of the previous day crashed back into his consciousness, and he opened his eyes to find the sky above him painted in soft shades of pink and gold. Dawn in the outback. Rusty was no longer beside him. Tommy's heart lurched with panic, the irrational fear that the dog had abandoned him too, before he spotted Rusty a few meters away, digging frantically at something in the sandy soil. The dog's back legs were working like pistons, sending sprays of red dirt flying behind him. What have you found, mate?" Tommy called out, his voice hoarse and cracking. Rusty paused his digging and looked back at Tommy, his tail wagging. Then he returned to his task with renewed vigor. Tommy dragged himself over, using his arms, his legs trailing uselessly behind him on the cold ground. When he reached Rusty's excavation site, he saw what the dog had uncovered: roots, fat, pale roots that looked like thick fingers emerging from the earth. Tommy had seen these before, in a book about bush tucker that one of his foster mothers had kept on her shelf. Bush potato, maybe, or some other type of yam that grew wild in the outback. The Aboriginal people had survived on these for tens of thousands of years. The roots were edible, nutritious, and most importantly, they contained moisture. "You're a genius," Tommy said, reaching out to help Rusty dig. His fingers scraped against the hard-packed earth, his nails splitting and bleeding, but he kept going. Together, they unearthed 3 good-sized roots, each one as long as Tommy's forearm. Tommy used a sharp rock to scrape away the outer skin of one root, revealing pale flesh underneath. He took a tentative bite. It was tough and fibrous, slightly sweet, with a texture like raw potato, not delicious but edible. And right now, that was all that mattered. He broke off a piece and offered it to Rusty, who sniffed it carefully before accepting it with gentle jaws. They ate in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, sharing the roots between them. Tommy's stomach, which had been a tight knot of hunger and fear, began to unclench. With water and food, however meager, they could survive out here, at least for a while. The question was, did they want to be found? Tommy thought about going back to Darwin, to the system that had chewed him up and spat him out repeatedly, another foster home, another family who would look at his twisted legs and his crutches and see only burden, only difficulty, only disappointment. The social worker who'd taken money to abandon him in the bush was probably filing paperwork right now, claiming he'd run away, covering her tracks. No one would be looking for him. No one ever really had been. "What if we just stayed out here?" Tommy said to Rusty, who was now lying in a patch of morning sunlight, his eyes half closed. "Just you and me. We could learn to survive like the Aboriginal people did. We've got water, we've got food. We'd figure out the rest." Rusty's tail thumped twice, but the dog's expression was skeptical, if dogs could be skeptical. Tommy laughed despite himself. "Yeah, you're right. I'm 8 years old and can barely walk. We'd last maybe a week before something got us. Snake, exposure, dehydration, take your pick." But the fantasy was appealing. No more foster homes, no more disappointed faces, no more being too hard, too broken, too much trouble. Just him and Rusty, surviving against the odds, proving everyone wrong by their very existence. The sound of an engine shattered the morning quiet. Tommy's head snapped up, his heart suddenly pounding. It was distant but getting closer, the distinctive rumble of a four-wheel drive navigating rough terrain. Rusty was on his feet immediately, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Shh, boy," Tommy whispered, reaching for Rusty's collar, only to remember the dog didn't have one. "It's all right. Might be help. Might be someone who can get us somewhere safe. But what if it wasn't? What if it was his foster father, coming back to finish the job? Or the social worker, panicking about what Tommy might tell people if he survived?" Tommy's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. He looked at Rusty, at the scars on the dog's body, at the torn ear that spoke of abuse and abandonment. "Hide," Tommy said suddenly, urgently. "Rusty, hide. If they find us, they'll separate us. They'll take you to the pound and me back to the system, and we'll never see each other again." Rusty seemed to understand. The dog moved quickly to a cluster of rocks and brush at the edge of the gully, positioning himself where he could see but not be easily seen. Tommy grabbed his crutches and tried to do the same, dragging himself behind a boulder just as the vehicle came into view on the ridge above them. It was a ute, old and battered, painted in faded blue. Not the social worker's car, not his foster father's vehicle either, someone else. Then Tommy held his breath as the ute slowed, then stopped. A door opened and slammed shut. Footsteps crunched on the gravel above. "Tracks here," a voice called out, male but weathered, older. Something came down into this gully. Could be stock, could be dog, hard to say. "Worth checking," another voice responded. "Younger, female. Everything's worth checking out here," the first voice said. "Never know what you'll find." Tommy pressed himself against the boulder, his crutches laid flat beside him so they wouldn't give away his position. He could see Rusty from where he hid, the dog absolutely still, only his eyes moving as he tracked the sounds above. The footsteps began to descend into the gully, loose rocks cascading down with each step. Tommy's breath came quick and shallow. Maybe these were good people, maybe they could help, but maybe they were something worse. And Tommy had learned the hard way that adults were just as likely to hurt you as help you. A figure appeared at the bottom of the gully, a man, maybe 60, with skin like leather from years in the sun and eyes that were sharp and assessing. He wore work clothes, dusty and worn, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He scanned the gully methodically, and Tommy knew the moment those sharp eyes found him, because they widened slightly, then narrowed with concern. "Found something," the man called up. "Better get down here, Sarah." Tommy considered running, but where would he go? His legs wouldn't carry him fast enough, and Rusty couldn't carry him forever. He was trapped, and maybe that had been inevitable from the start. Maybe this was always how it was going to end. The man approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, his body language deliberately non-threatening. When he was about 3 meters away, he stopped and crouched down, making himself smaller, less intimidating. "Hey, mate," the man said gently. "You all right? You hurt?" Tommy didn't answer. He stared at the man, trying to read his intentions, trying to figure out if this was friend or foe. The man's eyes dropped to Tommy's legs, to his crutches, and Tommy braced himself for the look he always got, the pity, the discomfort, the barely concealed disappointment. But it didn't come. The man's expression remained neutral, concerned but not shocked, assessing but not judging. "Name's Jim," the man said. "I run cattle on the station about 20 clicks from here. That's my daughter Sarah coming down now. We're not here to hurt you. We're just checking our water sources, making sure the bores are running clean. Finding a kid out here alone, that's unexpected, but we'll sort it out." The younger woman appeared beside Jim, and Tommy saw her eyes widen with shock when she saw him. She was maybe 30, with sun-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a face that looked kind, genuinely kind, in a way that made Tommy's chest ache. "Dad," Sarah breathed, her hand going to her mouth. "That's a child. What's a child doing out here alone?" Tommy found his voice then, rough and defensive. "I'm not alone. I've got Rusty." As if summoned, Rusty emerged from his hiding spot, moving to position himself between Tommy and the strangers. The dog's body was tense, protective, a low warning growl rumbling in his chest. Jim's eyes flicked to Rusty, taking in the scars, the torn ear, the defensive posture, and something knowing crossed his face. "That your dog?" Jim asked quietly. "He's mine, and I'm his," Tommy said, lifting his chin defiantly. "We're together. You can't separate us." Sarah and Jim exchanged a look, and Tommy saw something pass between them, some unspoken communication that came from years of knowing each other. Sarah moved slowly, carefully, and sat down on a nearby rock, making herself less threatening. Jim remained crouched. "No one's separating anyone," Sarah said gently. "But mate, you can't be out here alone. It's dangerous. How'd you end up in this gully?" Tommy's jaw clenched. He didn't want to tell them, didn't want to say the words out loud because saying them made them real, made them hurt in a way that silence kept at bay. But these people had kind eyes, both of them, and Tommy was so tired of carrying everything alone. "They left me here," he said finally, his voice small. "My foster father and the social worker said I was too hard to handle, too much trouble. They drove me out here and left me to die." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah's face went pale, then red with anger. Jim's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "Names," Jim said, his voice like gravel. "I need their names, son," Tommy told them. Told them everything, the words spilling out in a rush now that they'd started. The foster homes, the rejections, his mother's abandonment, the envelope of cash, the social worker's shaking hands. Sarah was crying by the time he finished, tears tracking clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. Jim's jaw was clenched so tight Tommy could see the muscle jumping. "Right," Jim said when Tommy finally fell silent. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to take you back to our station. We're going to feed you, give you somewhere safe to sleep, and we're going to get you proper medical attention. Then we're going to call the authorities, the real authorities, and we're going to make sure those bastards never hurt another kid again." "And Rusty?" Tommy asked, his hand finding the dog's fur, gripping tight. "What happens to him?" Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at her father. Jim studied Rusty for a long moment, taking in the dog's protective stance, the way he leaned into Tommy's touch, the bond that was obvious even to a stranger's eyes. "Rusty comes too," Jim said simply. "Any dog loyal enough to keep a kid alive in the outback deserves a home, and any kid brave enough to survive what you've survived deserves better than the hand you've been dealt." Tommy felt something break inside him, but in a good way, like ice cracking to let water flow beneath. "You mean it? You're not just saying that." "I don't say things I don't mean," Jim replied. "Now, can you walk with those crutches, or do you need help?" Tommy demonstrated his mobility, pulling himself up with Rusty's support, positioning his crutches under his arms. Sarah watched with interest, not pity, and Tommy felt a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. They made their way slowly up out of the gully, Rusty glued to Tommy's side, Jim and Sarah providing support when the terrain got too rough. The station homestead was everything Tommy had imagined and nothing like he'd expected. The house was old, weathered by decades of harsh sun and wind, but it was solid and real and welcoming. Sarah set him up in a spare room with a proper bed, soft sheets that smelled of lavender, and a bowl of water for Rusty. While Tommy showered, washing away layers of dirt and fear, Sarah made phone calls. Tommy could hear her voice through the door, hard and angry, demanding to speak to supervisors, threatening legal action, refusing to be placated or dismissed. Jim cooked dinner, a simple meal of steak and vegetables that tasted like heaven after bush roots. They ate together at a worn wooden table, and no one mentioned Tommy's legs or his crutches or the way his hands shook when he tried to cut his meat. Sarah simply cut it for him without comment, as natural as breathing, and they talked about the station, about the cattle, about the way the land changed with the seasons. "We've been thinking about fostering," Sarah said as they cleared the plates. "Dad and me. This station's too big for just the two of us, and I always wanted kids, but it never worked out. The agency said our location was too remote, that we couldn't provide the necessary support for children with additional needs." Tommy's heart sank. "Of course, the same story, different people." "But that's rubbish," Jim said gruffly, shooting his daughter a look. "We've got more to offer than any of those city people who see kids like you as projects instead of people. We've got space, we've got time, we've got patience, and we've got love. That's what matters." "What are you saying?" Tommy asked, afraid to hope, afraid to believe. Sarah came to sit beside him, her eyes serious. "I'm saying that if you want, after we sort out the legal mess with your previous placement, we'd like to apply to foster you. Properly. Long term. With Rusty, obviously. This isn't a quick fix or a temporary solution. We want to give you a home, a real one." Tommy looked at Rusty, who was lying at his feet, the dog's amber eyes watching him with that infinite patience, that unwavering loyalty. He thought about the moment in the car park when Rusty could have run away, could have saved himself, but had chosen instead to stay, to help, to care. He thought about how the dog had found water, had found food, had kept him warm through the cold night, how Rusty had refused to give up on him even when everyone else had. "A boy with a disability is abandoned, but what the dog does changes everything," Tommy said softly, more to himself than to them. "That's what happened, isn't it? Rusty changed everything. He saved my life, but more than that, he reminded me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that needing help doesn't make you a burden. That love isn't about being easy or convenient. It's about showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Jim's eyes were suspiciously bright. Sarah wasn't even trying to hide her tears anymore. "So what do you say, mate?" Jim asked. "Want to give us a try?" Tommy thought about all the times he'd been asked that question, all the times he'd hoped and been disappointed. But he thought about Rusty too, about trust and second chances, and the courage it takes to try again after being hurt. If a scarred, abandoned dog could choose to trust again, to love again, then maybe Tommy could too. "Yeah," Tommy said, his voice stronger now, more certain. "Yeah, I want to give it a try." 6 months later, Tommy sat on the veranda of the homestead, watching the sun set over the endless red earth. His legs were still twisted, still weak, but a physiotherapist from town came twice a week now, teaching him exercises, helping him build strength. He'd never walk normally, never run, but he could get around the station with his crutches and Rusty's help, could do chores, could feel useful and needed and wanted. The legal proceedings had been swift and brutal. The social worker had lost her license. Tommy's former foster father was facing criminal charges, and Tommy's case had sparked an investigation into the entire foster care system in the Northern Territory, exposing cracks and failures that had been ignored for too long. But more importantly, Tommy had a home. Sarah had officially fostered him, and they were talking about adoption once enough time had passed. Jim had taught him about the station, about reading the land and the sky, about patience and persistence. Sarah had taught him about love, the kind that wasn't conditional on being easy or perfect or whole. And Rusty had taught him the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the most broken things make the strongest bonds. The dog lay beside him now, his head on Tommy's lap, his tail thumping contentedly against the weathered wood of the veranda. They'd both gained weight, both healed in ways that went deeper than physical scars. "Love you, boy," Tommy whispered, scratching behind Rusty's torn ear. "You know that. You saved my life." Rusty's tail thumped harder, and Tommy smiled, because the truth was they'd saved each other. A boy with a disability, abandoned and left to die, and a dog with scars, unwanted and forgotten. Two broken things that had found each other in the vastness of the outback and had chosen, against all odds, to survive, to fight, to love. And that, Tommy thought, as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, that was everything.